I have put about 120 hours into the Lightning Saga over the course of roughly 2.5 months, with the express goal of figuring out whether or not the series is actually as bad as people say it is. In the pursuit of that forbidden knowledge, I have put out 2 videos covering FF13 and its sequel 13-2, and I think it's been clear thus far, this series has been striking a pretty good balance between tedious and enjoyable. And while each game has had their moments where I was having fun and enjoying myself, a lot of the playtime was spent honestly just wishing that they would be over with quickly. And part of this is on myself. I've played both 13 and 13-2 before, and although I didn't remember much of 13, they both still had that sense of deja vu where I remembered many aspects about them. Final Fantasy 13 Lightning Returns didn't have that same problem with me as I have never played before. I've never even really seen gameplay of it, to be honest with you, so I was excited to jump right into the world, because for me, new games and new experiences will always be more enjoyable or more favorable than replaying games I've already beaten, even if those games are some of my favorites. Now, this video is going to not only be covering my thoughts for Lightning Returns, but at the end will encapsulate my feelings for the series as a whole. If you want to hear about specific main story quests or zones, I'll be sure to mark them out in the description, so feel free to jump around the video as you see fit. And with that said, and out of the way, let's just jump straight into the game's mechanics, shall we? So I figured that this time around, I would merge the player freedom and linearity sections that I usually have with the combat and gameplay systems, since together they all make up what is the meat and potatoes of the game's core mechanics. And speaking of the game's mechanics, let's talk about the combat, because it was probably my least favorite element of the moment-to-moment gameplay. Now please note that I don't hate the combat in this game, and I actually think it was an improvement from the previous 2 entries, noticeably so in fact. The main idea of the combat is still there, with that of course being the ability to switch between 3 set customizable stances. Those stances being the paradigms that you have in 13 and 13-2, and now the newly introduced schemata in Lightning Returns. The schemata are in essence 3 different fully customizable kits that you can slap onto Lightning. And when I say fully customizable, I mean fully customizable. You can change what outfit she wears, which will often have an effect on which spells and abilities she can cast. You can change what weapon she has, which usually comes with its own set of substats. Same goes for changing her shield. You can give her 2 accessories as well as 1 adornment, which is basically just a decoration. And finally, you can assign up to 4 different abilities provided your outfit doesn't have locked abilities set to it. There is just a ton to customize here and play around with so that you get your perfect schema. It's way more customizable than the paradigms, which really only allowed for you to change which class your characters were on. And while it is more customizable, you do have a severe lack in overall choices of abilities when in the actual combat. Whilst, yes, there are more choices for spells and abilities overall, you are limited to the use of 12 of them when it comes to the combat itself, as opposed to being able to select any spell or technique or ability that you've gained manually up to that point in the prior game. So ultimately, there are many more aspects surrounding combat for you to engage in, but less overall ways to fight enemies when you're in an actual battle. And speaking of actual battles, let's take a look at how they play out, shall we? Similarly to FF13-2, enemies will spawn onto the map as you're exploring, giving you the ability to hit them with your weapon to initiate an instanced-off battle. However, unlike 13-2, there is no time limit, meaning that you won't be automatically stuck into a battle if you don't hit them or run away fast enough, and can choose to completely avoid them should you please. But on the flip side, if you choose to engage in a battle, hitting the enemies or getting hit by the enemies will grant you a buff or debuff depending on the alertness of said enemy. Now what I mean by that is if you hit the enemy and they haven't noticed you at all, they will start the fight with 25% less HP. If you hit an enemy with them being aware of your presence, that's 10% less HP. And if you get hit by an enemy rather than you hitting them, you will start the battle with 5% less HP. It's a nice way to incentivize proactiveness when it comes to combat, provided you wish to actually engage the enemies in the field. And I say provided you want to engage with them because it really isn't a necessity to enter into many battles, unless you require mob drops for crafting or a quest, or maybe want to farm a weapon. Because unlike the previous games, and a change I kinda hate, you don't gain experience or levels or stat boosts or anything of the sort from engaging in combat, like almost every other JRPG and RPG under the sun. Instead, the way your character gains all of their stat boosts is by completing quests, main, side, or otherwise, and the reason I hate this is because those quote-unquote side quests ultimately wind up being less of optional activities and more or less necessary for the completion of the game, if you don't want to go into the final dungeon being unable to kill even the basic mobs, because again, like the other games, the final act is for some reason an insane difficulty spike. Now with that said, most of your important and large increases in stats will come from the main quests, which leads me to believe that if you played on the easy difficulty, you could probably get away with not touching too many side quests. However, on medium, which is the difficulty I chose to play the game on, even having done something along the lines of 58 of the available 66 side quests, I was still left thinking to myself in the final act, man, this difficulty is noticeably increased. So I can imagine, had I not done nearly so much of the quests, I would have probably struggled a lot more. Is the final dungeon impossible? Well, no, definitely not, and in fact, I think overall it's a much more well-balanced game than the prior entries, but the choice to tie character stat increases to the completion of quests was just not a great one. Now with that said, let's get back to battles, and assume you did decide to hit the enemy to engage in Mortal Kombat. You'll be loaded into a separate instanced arena where you can fight your tiny little heart out. As stated before, the core idea is the same. You'll notice on the left hand side of the screen, you have 3 little colored bars. Those are your ATB gauges. Unlike the prior entries in the series where you just waited for the ATB to fill up, you start this game with a set amount, usually based on what outfit you're wearing grants you, and you can spend however much you have available on your 4 spells and abilities you have set to that specific schemata you are currently wearing, which you can see are mapped to your 4 buttons here on the right. You can then switch to one of your other 2 schemata by pressing the bumper/trigger buttons, and that previous schemata that you were just on will begin regenerating the ATB that you had just spent. This goes for all schemata that aren't currently active. Basically, you'll be dancing around your stances quite often to maximize the use of your ATB. Now let's talk about those spells and skills, because they obviously had to make some sacrifices and changes to make the new form of combat work, and a lot of those changes and sacrifices I'm not too keen on. Namely, needing to put your guard as one of your skill slots, and do keep in mind, you will need a guard on at the very least one of your schemata, because healing is limited in this game, which we will get to in a moment. Now outside of just having a slot that is dedicated to guarding, some outfits will also have locked abilities tied to them. For example, if you play with the Dragoon garb, then you will always have the ability Lancet locked to you. The Mikote dress will always have Metaguard and Magic Slash locked to it. Basically, it can, not always, but can be detrimental, because maybe you like the way a garb looks as well as the stats and substats that it gives you, but dislike the abilities locked to it, then you're just gonna have to choose one of those to give up. It just gets a little frustrating at times. It's not the end of the world, but it's something that feels counterintuitive to the whole pro player choice stance that they were taking when it came to the combat and player builds. Now I had mentioned before the fact that you were basically required to guard due to the lack of healing choices in the game. So, here's what they did to the healing. They took the usual medic and healer role that is present in pretty much every other Final Fantasy and said let's do away with that. Instead, let's give the player a limited number of healing items that they can use during an encounter, and let's have every single item that could even remotely be counted as quote recovery take up a slot. This includes healing potions, Phoenix Downs, potions that grant defense buffs, potions that grant attack buffs, and so on. You get the point. I absolutely hate this. This is my single most hated change they made. I would have much preferred a spell system that grants you the ability to just heal yourself, rather than this stupid contrived limited healing item bullcrap that they're trying to pull. And I can hear those people who have already beaten or played the game typing their comments like, "Oh well Jay, you can still technically cast Curaga," and I am aware of that, and I'm going to use this moment to segue into the EP abilities. Basically, Lightning gets access to these things called EP abilities, which act as stronger, more impactful spells and moves to use both in and out of combat. Unlike ATB though, your gauge to use them does not recover over time. You start with a full gauge every time you beam down to start exploring, and can slowly spend said gauge on different abilities, things like Curaga to fully recover outside of battle, or Overclock, which essentially slows time for a bit during battle and allows you to use as many abilities as you want before the gauge runs out. You're awarded a teeny tiny little bit of EP back after each battle, meaning if you want to continuously use certain abilities, you'll be needing to engage in combat to earn them back. I was always lacking in EP points because of a cute little problem I ran into, which I have no clue if it is exclusive to me or not, but essentially, I was playing using a PS4 controller, and whenever I would try to switch my schemata in battle, on my PS4 controller, the button you press to switch schemata was also mapped to the button you would press to activate Overclock, meaning that I was always activating Overclock if I had 2 or more EP points currently available to me whenever I tried to switch my schemata in battle. This was extremely infuriating because there were many EP abilities that I would have liked to use outside of battle, however I wasn't able to due to this teeny tiny mishap with the PS4 controller's button mappings. Things like Chronostasis, which allows you to pause the flow of time when you're not currently engaged in a fight. Which leads me into my next system I want to speak on, the time-based mechanic. As many of you may know, FF13 Lightning Returns operates on a time-based system, in which you start with 6 days to engage with all the content available before the final day rolls around and you're tossed into the story's finale. However, by completing side quests, you can gain something called Aradia. You then feed it to this giant biblically accurate tree, and after you give it a set amount, you'll gain extra days, up to a max of 8, totaling 14 days. Which on the surface seems like just a nice way to let players have extra time to complete everything they want to do, however, has a sneaky little bit of annoyingness attached to it. On the one hand, yes, it allows you more playtime, but on the other hand, it's an annoying way to time gate certain content. You wanted to do this quest investigating ghost sightings in the city? Well, joke's on you, you have to wait until 12 AM to start, and you need to be finished by 6 AM. You wanted to purchase this strong weapon that you have the funds for? Well, you silly little kid, you gotta wait until day 10 to do that. You get the idea. Most content is locked into only being available during certain times of day, or locked behind waiting for certain days. And a lot of these days you can't get to without doing enough quests to feed enough Aradia to the tree to be able to unlock more time. And it's not like you ever feel as though you're short on time or anything like that because of Chronostasis. Even having the stupid PS4 controller bug, I was able to finish pretty much every side quest and main quest that I wanted to do by the end of day 10, leaving me 4 extra days of just running around and farming stuff. It just ties back to the illusion of having more optional content than it actually does. You want to get the best weapons or gear, then you'll have to do the side quests to get the extra days. You want to get the most stats, then you better farm up those side quests. Now, despite how nitpicky I'm being about this one point, that being my hatred for the questing system, I want to be clear. I enjoyed its approach to the layout of its content overall leagues more than FF13 and 13.2. Now, obviously, I didn't cover every nitty-gritty little piece of content or mechanic out there because there is a ton in this game that you could go over, and I'm sure no one would care to listen about how you grow Gasol greens in the Wildlands for 5 minutes straight, or how you can merge spells and abilities together to give more favorable substats to the spells you like, which is pretty much the exact same system as the monster merging in 13.2, but I tried to cover as much as I possibly could, and this opinion that I'm about to state goes for pretty much every aspect of gameplay, covered or otherwise. I think it's the best in the entire trilogy. The player freedom when it comes to builds and approaching both the story and side activities is superbly welcome coming off the back of two pretty damn linear games. The combat is also the most interesting of the offerings put forth in the trilogy, although I will take a moment here to share a thought about the combat. That being, I caught myself thinking, this would be much better if it was more action oriented. And by that, I mean do away with the loading into a separate instanced area and keep everything the exact same. The enemies already spawn into the world map as it is, why not change the button you have mapped to swinging your sword to initiate combat into a button to activate a sort of battle ready stance, and then you're able to just fight the enemies in the open map. I know it's not due to technical limitations, because they were able to achieve the exact same thing I'm talking about right now back in 2002 with Kingdom Hearts. Of course, that combat isn't exactly for everyone, but I figured I'd at least lay that little what-if scenario in your heads, because it's been playing non-stop in my own ever since I picked the game up, but I digress. I think pretty much every aspect in terms of gameplay on offer is just about as good as you're going to get from the Lightning Saga. Now, with everything I wanted to touch on pertaining to the core gameplay out of the way, let's get to the world and the story, because there is honestly a lot more emphasis on both of those things this time around, which, I mean, it makes sense, seeing as it is the finale of the entire saga. So, directly opposing the content available of the trilogy, this game's world and story are by far the weakest. It's like not even a competition. They looked at all the confusing jumbled mess that they had created with the previous two games and realized, hey, we need to figure out a way to make it all understandable and come together for the series' ending. But in doing so, made what is probably the most confusing finale to a series I've ever seen. The world that had been brought up and fleshed out through the previous two games, whilst technically still here, is basically completely gone. After the ending of 13.2, where Valhalla and Pulse merged together, the world was completely reshaped, so by, a technicality, we are still on Pulse, but it's like a weird gross amalgamation of Pulse and Valhalla, which is now called the Nova Chrysalia. It's separated into 4 distinct feeling zones, which we'll be covering individually since the story doesn't exactly become linear until the end of the game, as in you can complete every main story in whichever order that you want, and for my sanity, I'm just gonna summarize them in the order that I completed them in, but before we get to summarizing each zone and its stories, we need to get past the game's intro. The game starts with a beautifully rendered cutscene of Lightning crashing Snow's end of the world party that he's holding, but it doesn't have any voice acting, so you just get Lightning and Snow awkwardly talking with each other without any actual voices. It then proceeds to play the exact same cutscene again, but now it actually has the voice acting. Is it gonna play this whole cutscene again, just with voice acting this time? That is gonna be so fucking obnoxious, dude. Anyways, after crashing the banquet, we are interrupted by this little childlike version of Sarah known as Lumina. We chase Snow around his palace for a bit and get the intro to the combat and the basic mechanics and what have you. Snow then barricades himself in a room with this stuff called the Chaos, which is what spawns all the spooky monsters and what was held within Valhalla, and unable to break in, we take off back to the Ark. The Ark, or as we know it, the floating city of Bunavelza, is the hub world. Essentially, the god Bunavelza, to which Hope had named his new cocoon after, used Hope's new cocoon after Valhalla floated forth, and repurposed it to be a place where time does not flow, acting as a safe place for Lightning, his champion, and Hope to make their game plan. Oh yeah, Lightning is also now the sorta puppet champion for the god Bunavelza, as he wants to remake the world since it's kinda fucked now, but he needs someone to save the souls of the living, which is your job. And to do so, he's holding Sarah hostage and blackmailing us. Hope is also a child again, even though he was an adult when time stopped flowing back at the end of 13.2, which, like, it isn't ever properly explained, so don't expect that to get addressed at all. But that's essentially the setup for the current plot. Hope then explains to us that we have 5 spots on the map where we gotta go investigate, essentially plopping us 5 main quests to choose from. He then beams us down to the first of our 4 major zones to explore, the holy city of Luxerion.
Everything looks shiny in that sun. A day in your life. Close your eyes to find yourself.
So right after we get off the train at Luxerion, we notice a pink-haired lady has been absolutely gutted and just left in the streets. Right after that, a very mediocre recreation of what is supposed to be lightning is draped from the clock tower with a threatening message that the savior, i.e. lightning, is going to be murdered by the hunter in black or something along those lines. Of course, we take it upon ourselves to get to the bottom of this murder, where we learn this isn't the first time something like this has happened. It's actually happened 3 times now. We figure someone is obviously trying to bait us out, so we go around looking for clues. We learn that the city is under the protection of the church that follows Bonavelza. However, there is a second fanatical group that follows Etro who are particularly shady. We decide it's worth investigating and tail some of the shady looking fanatics to a graveyard. However, to enter said graveyard, we need a code that is only available to be seen after 6 AM, and this is the most annoying part of the game's entire main quest, by a long shot, because you need to look for 4 specific numbers which are only available after 6 AM, right? However, the game auto-teleports you back to the Ark at 6 AM every day, so you can't just do the first part of the quest and then wait around to do the second part. You have to go to the Ark and come back. Then when you do come back, you realize one of the numbers you need is in a part of the map that is only accessible after 12 AM, meaning you have to wait around and find other things to do for 18 in-game hours. This is what I mean by the time system being an arbitrary way to time lock content and being annoying. This shit right here. Anyways, after you do get the number in the Warrens, you encounter that little girl Lumina again, who shows you an oracle drive of you getting murdered by someone. We are then ambushed by, surprise, it's Noel Christ, who believes he has to kill us to save the future. With the new code, we head back to the graveyard and infiltrate the cultists, who are in the middle of their nightly murdering of a pink-haired damsel in distress. We team up with Noel, who has followed us here, and take out all of the cultists. Noel then implores us to follow him since we need to be at the, quote, right spot for our final confrontation. And where is this right spot, you might be asking? Well, it's the Warrens, of course. You know, the place we were just at, where we had just fought Noel, like, a minute of talking ago. Anyways, we follow him to the Warrens, and wouldn't you know it, he also has an oracle drive of him killing us and saving the future and living happily ever after with Yule and stuff. Of course, we then do battle with Noel and beat him, although afterwards it plays one of those cutscenes where, even though we technically beat him in the battle, he still has the opportunity to kill us for, you know, reasons, I guess, but he ultimately decides not to and stabs the oracle drive instead. Yule then appears and promises they'll be together again soon, and we are given Noel's soul and a nice little boost to our stats. And whilst that is technically the end of Luxerion's main story, there's a bit more to it than that. So after we beat up Noel, we are informed that the High Priestess Lady of the Church would like to meet with us, and after doing some menial side quests to grant ourselves midnight access to the cathedral grounds, we get to meet up with Vanille, who is no longer in crystal stasis, having woken up 13 years ago. She tells us her grand master plan. She apparently can hear the souls of the dead who are trapped in the chaos that Valhalla brought forth. With Etro being dead, they have nowhere to go, so they're just amassing in the chaos. Vanille is gathering them all within the cathedral and plans to, on the final day, perform a ritual to which all the souls will be saved and will peacefully pass on and, you know, be at peace and shit. And with that little piece of exposition delivered, we are now at the real end of Luxerion's main story. I really like Luxerion. Like, aesthetically, it is probably my favorite of the 4 major zones. It's like a more technologically advanced version of an 1860s London. The church is the main governing body in the entirety of what's left of our world, and they're trying to keep their citizens safe in the final days before the end, but no one's happy. Everyone has lost their will to live ages ago. Everyone's just depressed, and the cherry on top is the secondary fanatical organization that's just going around terrorizing the town with their beliefs that the savior Lightning is evil. There was even a quest where I was searching for a little girl that was being followed throughout the city by these fanatics. You basically had to run from payphone to payphone trying to pinpoint her exact location. Ultimately, she winds up in the Warrens. I wasn't aware of this though, and forgot to finish the quest for a few days, and when I came back, I had failed the quest, and the little girl had been murdered and her body dumped in the streets. That's goddamn brutal.
I let her
You a fake gamer?
I let her get murdered by the fanatics because I didn't rescue her quick enough.
You're a fucking fake gamer.
Damn it.
There are a bunch of super neat side quests like that. There's one I mentioned earlier where you hear a rumor about ghost sightings around the old graveyard, and you have to run around talking to a number of ghosts. Or one where a girl is selling her tears to the depressed residents of Luxerion because they don't have any tears left to shed. In terms of overall memorability, Luxerion sticks out the most with its questing, that's for sure. They have absolutely nailed the vibes they were going for, that of a drab, devoid of joy, kind of gross city overall at the end of their rope, and I love it. And while it may be my favorite aesthetics and tonnage wise, it wasn't actually my favorite to play through. Nah. That honor lay in Yusnaan's lap. The only and best way I can think to describe Yusnaan is if Nautilus from FF13 had delivered on any of its promises. For the entirety of the time you play as Saz and Vanille starting in Chapter 4, all the way up until you play them again in Chapter 8, you hear non-stop about how Nautilus is the entertainment capital, how people go there to gamble their life away and forget all their problems, how there's chocobos and games and rides and just so much stuff to do there. And then all the way in Chapter 8, like 15 hours of playtime into the game, you arrive, and what do? You watch a pre-rendered cutscene of a parade explaining the war between Cocoon and Pulse, and you check out some chocobos, and then you fight the military. Now excuse me if I'm being a bit too ambitious here, but would it have killed them to have let the player, engage with some mini-games for a bit or something here, or at the very least, made it seem more lively than it was? What I'm trying to say is Nautilus was a fucking disappointment compared to how the characters in the world talked about it. Yusnaan, on the other hand, is far from a disappointment. It is a city that is holding a never-ending banquet in celebration of the fact that the world is coming to an end soon and people will actually be able to die properly, and it just feels like it. Everything is so festive. There's chocobo girls dancing in the streets, people performing for crowds eating their dinner. When it comes nighttime, a never-ending rain of fireworks starts going off. There's a coliseum where people fight for the enjoyment and the pleasure of the crowds. Hell, there's even a side quest where Lightning can go on a date with some random-ass lonely middle-aged dude who got stood up by another chick. It just takes all the festivities promised with Nautilus and actually delivers on them. So what is the story for Yusnaan then? Well, after we failed to catch Snow in his palace, the city has gone onto high alert, meaning we can't get back into the palace at all and need to find a separate way to enter. We hear a rumor that we can sneak in through an abandoned entrance down by the warehouse district, and so during the night, we haul ourselves out there to sneak in. However, we are stopped by Lumina, who summons a Cyclops to block off our path and prevent us entry. After we deal with that Cyclops, we are dropped into the warehouse district and just so happen to stumble upon a keycard that will grant us access to the palace's courtyard, which is just oh so very convenient. What luck Lightning sure does have, am I right? We of course head to the courtyard, but we need to figure a way to get to the actual palace itself. Hope then cooks up a brilliant idea. Alright, get this. So there's this play that's going to be happening here in a bit, right? And the grand finale is going to be using a bunch of fireworks to add a little spark, a little flare, right? Okay, so all you have to do is first convince the play's manager that he should double or even triple up on the fireworks as to weaken this giant statue that is the centerpiece for the play. Then you need to convince him that you should be playing the leading role instead of the actual actress, right? Okay, you're following so far? Then you need to break the statue after the fireworks have weakened it and ride it like a surfboard over the fence, thus gaining easy access into the palace. Simple is as simple does, to be honest with you. So after we somehow managed to convince the manager to up the number of fireworks and ask to be the main event, he basically says we are astronomical levels of ugly and should go compete in the local coliseum to acquire some new drip worthy of being upon his stage. So we go do just that. After swiftly taking care of an all things considered very lackluster tournament, like I'm talking absolute bottom of the anime tournament arc tier list, we are given our new outfit. We then return to the stage manager and he tells us we look bonita, and we get the cool cutscene of Lightning tearing up the stage and entering the palace. We find Snow has locked himself behind some ice and go searching for a method to get in, quickly snatching up his engagement necklace that he had given to Sarah, which just magically has the power to melt the ice for some reason. So I'm not gonna lie, I kinda wasn't paying attention here at this moment. I was watching a really dope video about the history of the Corpse Party franchise by Thaf9, but the wiki tells me that Snow wants us to kill him as a way to atone for Sarah's death, and absorbs a bunch of chaos he had been hiding in the palace to protect the citizens of Yusnaan. We fight him and of course come out victorious and turn him back to his normal sane self by convincing him that Sarah's soul still wants to be with him, and that is where the Yusnaan main story ends. Now, Yusnaan and Luxerion are pretty much tied when it comes to the quality and memorability in terms of their quests, and whilst I do think Luxerion takes the cake by just a smidge, I did want to at least acknowledge the stories I thought were super neat from Yusnaan. For example, the two death game quests. Essentially, Biggs and Wedge are holding a sort of death game show where you enter into the warehouse district and have to kill a set amount of enemies for shits and giggles, which is revealed to actually be a way for people to kill themselves in a thrilling way, since people are so desperate to die in this world. And of course, there's also the aforementioned date quest. Lightning stumbles upon a dude who's hanging out all lonely, and he's like, oh, I got stood up for a date, and Lightning's all like, well, damn, that sucks, and then he's all like, hey, you wanna go on a date together? And then Lightning's like, yeah, sure, haha, wink wink, nudge nudge. And then Hope is like, hey, maybe he actually thinks you wanna go on a date with him. And Lightning responds like, nah, surely not, but you know, it wouldn't hurt to come make sure he doesn't just sit there waiting. And sure enough, he is in fact just sitting there waiting for you, and you get a nice little scene of you two enjoying the fireworks together. Overall, Yusnaan is superb to play through. It's oozing personality that Nautilus tried and failed to deliver on, and there are a lot of cute little activities for you to engage in here, like finding all the chocobos and saying their cute little catchphrase, meow meow, choco chow, for which you'll be awarded the only outfit that matters in the entire game, the cat girl, or as more cultured gamers will refer to it, the Mikote outfit. Now I hate to have to do this, but I have to go from my favorite zone I played through to my least favorite zone I played through, and that is none other than the Dead Dunes. The Dead Dunes just sucks. In every sense of the imagination, it has the least amount of side quests available, with only 8 total, although 3 of them can be scratched off of that list, as they're either too time consuming or too difficult to be doing feasibly on a first time playthrough, and one of them is just legitimately not a side quest, like you need to complete it for the main quest. On top of that, it's the largest or second largest zone in the game. I'm not exactly sure which is bigger, this or the Wildlands, but it's also the least visually diverse and appealing of all the zones. Not to mention that 75% of your actual playtime is spent spelunking through a god-awful maze underneath the sand that will have you backtracking through the desert to complete stupid fetch quests to open one dumbass door to finish the story. I absolutely despise the Dead Dunes and every idea they tried to cram into this place. None of the quest stories are interesting, the zone itself is ugly and unfun to traverse, it is by far the shortest of all the offerings despite taking up the most landmass. I hate it with a burning passion. So in the Dead Dunes, we join a bandit gang called Monoculus, which is being led by Fang. She wants our help to go dungeon diving and find a neat little artifact somewhere in the labyrinth under the desert that Vanille needs to perform her ritual on the final day. Of course, we agree to help her because, that's our good old friend Fang. How could we turn her down? We find the door that would lead us to the artifact, which is named the Holy Clavis, but we can't proceed because we need to read 3 murals. But to read these 3 murals, we need to collect 3 tablets, and to collect these 3 tablets, we need to go to 3 different temples. You can see why I despise this place. Anyways, after we collect the 3 tablets and read the 3 murals, we get a bit more insight onto the world. Bonavelza is a classic case of Zeus and Kronos. Basically, he kills his mom, a god named Mwyn. He murdered her in the hopes of taking over full control of the mortal world, but he's a paranoid little shit, so he made a god named Pulse to find the entrance to the unseen world, which is where the dead go. He then made Etro to assist Pulse, but accidentally created her in Mwyn's likeness, so he grants her no powers nor any job, and instead replaces her with a new god, Lindsay. Then he tells Pulse to create the world, and tells Lindsay to protect the world, and promptly puts himself into a crystal stasis sleep. Etro gets really depressed over the fact that she is both powerless and purposeless in this world, and so resolves to kill herself, to which Lindsay uses her blood to create the human race. Etro then is sent to the Unseen Realm, where she meets Mwyn and is tasked with being the guardian of the dead and protecting the balance between life and death, for if it isn't maintained, the universe itself will collapse in on itself and the world will be destroyed, which is, exactly the scenario we're in right now. So that's a nice little bit of lore that we get there, but, I can't help but feel like it would have been nice to not have saved it until the final game in the series, and I'm sure that bits and pieces of this lore were sprinkled about in one of the million data log entries in the other games, but this is some serious world building that's kind of really important to the story you're trying to tell, and you're just now dropping it on everyone this far into the game? It would have made much more sense to, have learned this sometime during the events of 13.2, in my opinion. I digress though. After we listen to all the murals, the door finally opens and we can go snag the Holy Clavis, and gasp, what's this? Fang attempts to destroy it. Before we can get an explanation why though, we are ambushed by some of the followers of the church and are forced into a boss fight, after which we realize they stole the Clavis in the commotion. Fang then reveals that the ritual will actually kill Vanille, which I have no damn clue why she didn't just lead with that from the beginning. Because there is a 99.99% chance Lightning would try to find an alternative or convince Vanille to not go through with it. It's not like they are strangers or something, they're practically Lightning's only friends. Lightning then tells Fang to meet her at the church on the final day, and that's the end to the Dead Dune storyline, and honestly, good fucking riddance. I could not be more happy to be done with this place. I hate it so much. From the ugly yellow and brown color scheme that the entire place has, to the bullshit skeleton enemies that spawn right on top of you and make it impossible to avoid battle, there is one saving grace to the entire zone, and it's the optional dungeon that you unlock if you get the extra 14th day and the super boss. Which I'll talk about both of them later in greater detail. For now though, I think it's best we leave behind this God's Forsaken Land and head to the final zone of the game, and the longest of them all by virtue of actually having 2 main story quests, the Wildlands. So for me personally, the Wildlands is just a smidge better than the Dead Dunes by the fact that there's more things to do here and it's not an ugly brown and yellow desert. Though I can't say it's much better on the eyes overall, most of the zone is either a maze-like forest / rocky crags area or different shades of green and yellow plains. If I was to put up side by side the Wildlands and several other grass-like areas in different video games, I imagine you'd be hard-pressed to think they look all too different outside of graphical presentation and individual stylization. Now that doesn't go for the entire zone, as there are 5 distinct, I guess you would call them, districts, and only 3 of the 5 are plains types areas. The other 2 are a forest and a rocky ravine, respectively. None of the quests on offer are super great either. It's a lot of collect X amount of materials and turn them in for a potion to give to someone, or kill X amount of enemies to prove you're a good hunter, you know, stuff like that. Boring kill and collect fetch quests. And best of all, the Wildlands is home to my favorite creature in gaming history, this dog that looks straight out of an N64 game. I mean, look at it in all its triangular glory. So, the first of our two stories starts as soon as we set foot off the train in the Wildlands. We get a voice in our head telling us stories about finding the white chocobo and riding it across the chaos to the Temple of Etro. Curious as to what the hell any of that means, we decide to head to the nearest settlement, that being a farm smack dab in the middle of the plains. After we find our way there, some old dude is all like, "Oh, yeah, the white chocobo, I seen that fella before, he probably out in the old ruins being murdered by a chocobo eater or something." So we of course set off to the ruins and do battle with the chocobo eater, which has no relation to the boss of the same name from FF10. After which, the old man from before rolls up and takes the chocobo back to the farm. From here, you have to figure out a way to gather up food items to feed the chocobo in an attempt to get it recovered to full health. This wasn't that difficult, since most of the side quests around the area award you some form of edible to feed the chocobo, and after the little fella's all healed up, you are told to head to the base of the temple where a small civilization has formed full of the followers of Etro. After we head into the temple, we meet Caius, who's still around and kicking, and he blasts our ass all the way down to the bottom and gives us a debuff that constantly drains our health that was pretty much completely pointless. Like, I honestly forgot about it until I was writing the script for this video. Anyways, throughout our travels from the bottom of the temple to the top, we run into a bunch of various Yules, and they inform us that the greater chaos as a whole is actually the fragments of all the dead Yules, and they want us to save Caius' soul so he can go and live in the new world that Bonavelza's crafting up. And after what was, all things considered, one of the hardest boss fights in a game I've had in a while with Caius that I somehow managed to scrape a first try victory out of, we learn Caius cannot be saved because there are too many Yules with too many conflicting wishes. Some want him to be saved, others want him to stay, thus he is bound to the chaos. We depart the temple being unable to save anyone there and are informed upon our exit that our little Choco Bro was actually just the reincarnation of our summon Odin the entire time, and Lumina is also there and implies that there's a Yule who doesn't want to be with Caius, obviously meaning the one that wishes to be with Null. So after we finish up with that main quest, we can head off to the secondary quest held within the Wildlands. Tucked away in the corner of one of the plains, there is a crashed airship, and inside said crashed airship, there is a washed up, jaded old man that we all know as Saz. He's down in the dumps and all depressed because his son Dodge fell into a coma and won't wake up, saying that his soul has been split up into a bunch of fragments and he's been looking for like hundreds of years and can't find any of them. We then leave the ship and literally 5 feet from the door, find one of the fragments. Lumina then appears, saying she's going to be watching over to see if we can collect them all. Also, I feel like now is a good time to mention that during all of this, there's a bunch of cutscenes where Lightning talks with Lumina, or a fake version of Sarah in her mind, whenever she returns to the Ark. But because they don't know what order players will choose to complete the game's main story in, they try their best to keep it as vague as possible, while still also barely hinting and nudging at what's to come. But they're so pointless, I've pretty much omitted mentioning them entirely. Things like, "Oh man, Bonavelza stole Sarah's soul from you." Like, yeah, no shit, we already knew that. It was pretty clearly stated at the start of the game that Bonavelza is holding her hostage to have Lightning do his bidding. I just figured that it was worth a tiny mention. The gist of what has been told so far is that Bonavelza stole Sarah's soul from Lightning, she feels a little bit incomplete, like she's missing a part of herself, Lumina has implied that Hope is a puppet and we may not be human, and Lightning says that she will kill Bonavelza if he doesn't uphold his side of the bargain. Anyways, with that out of the way, we can continue our journey to find the rest of Dodge's soul. The game just tells you pretty much exactly where to go to find each fragment, which I think is extremely lazy. If they wanted to have an info dump to tell you where they were, they could have at least made it part of that cutscene with Lumina just after finding the first fragment, but I digress. The second fragment is from Chocolina, which is easy enough to retrieve. You just need to complete one of her Canvas of Prayer missions. And Canvas of Prayer is just straight up, imagine a long line of easy and quick to complete side quests that are 90% of the time just fetching items, by far the worst form of optional content available. The third fragment is being held by a soul seed trader. Soul seed traders are vendors who will purchase, well, soul seeds off of you, which I'll talk about in detail later on, so I'm not going to get into what they are or how to obtain them right now. All you need to know is they want you to get some fancy Moogle fragment, which can be obtained from the Moogle village in the woods. Once you're in that village, you will also reconnect with Mog and recruit him to help you out on the final day. The fourth fragment can be found on a cactuar in the desert. I don't have any footage of me gathering this one because I already had it on my person at the time I initiated the quest, having already killed a cactuar during my escapades in the Dead Dunes. And lastly, the fifth and final fragment is being offered up as a prize in Yusnaan's Coliseum, which, I don't know about you, seems an awfully strange prize to be offering up to random people like, ah yes, come compete and win some random kid's soul. After you retrieve all of the soul fragments, Saz does his little ritual, puts on a happy face, and finally Dodge wakes the hell up. Honestly, I don't know why it took Saz so long to find a single fragment. I found all 5 within the span of 20 minutes of playtime. Seems to me as if he just didn't want his kid to wake up. The Wildlands overall had my 2 least favorite storylines, healing a chocobo and slowly running through Etro's temple whilst getting exposition dumps from the Yules was insanely boring. And the Saz quest was so simple and pointless, it could have just been an extra step within the first main quest, like while your chocobo was recovering, they have you find Dodge's soul fragment, something like that. 60% of the map is your average bare-bones JRPG Plains area, and the other 40% is an annoyingly confusing maze with doors that for some reason they thought would be funny if they were time-gated for certain hours of the day, and a ravine that you can't properly navigate until your chocobo is fully healed, and even then, it's even more confusing than the forest. None of the side quests are particularly intriguing either, despite the Wildlands having the most out of all of the zones. They for some reason even reused the same fucking herd the sheep quest format 3 times, which is just so stupid. Surely they could have thought of something better than that, right? The only reason I enjoyed the Wildlands more than I did the Dead Dunes was purely on the fact it was not nearly as annoying to navigate, it looks more visually diverse and eye-appealing even if it is mostly just generic plains, and the enemies were so much easier to avoid if I didn't want to fight them. Now with all the individual zone storylines and my thoughts on them being summarized, let's get to the finale. So right before the final day, we get a few more cutscenes with Lumina, and she just gives us more confusing exposition about not trusting our friends, not being whole, missing a part of ourselves that we don't even realize, thus we aren't able to save anyone, not even Sarah. It's just a lot of confusing word vomit, to be honest. And after that, we get to meet with Cid Raines, who is for some reason the embodiment of the chaos as a whole, and I say for some reason despite knowing that reason is 100% to save on the budget of creating a new character model. Basically, Cid tells us that actually the ritual Vanille is going to perform at the behest of Bunavelza will erase all the dead people from existence, as Big Boy Bunny sees them as impurities, and informs us Vanille can actually do the opposite and save all their souls. Since we, I guess, cannot now, we can't get rid of the chaos because it's what human hearts are made of, but we can save the souls of those trapped inside. When someone dies, they hang out in the chaos until they're reborn, Sarah included, meaning if Vanille does her ritual, Sarah dies. So we head to the cathedral in Luxerion and fight our way through, eventually teaming up with Fang to get Vanille to stop. Snow crashes the party to stop the ritual, then Vanille begins to save the souls of the damned, and I guess Fang just magically has the ability to do so as well because she helps Vanille despite the Chaos version of Raines never mentioning Fang ever, which is odd, but whatever. And after that is done, the bells begin to toll, marking the end of the beginning, and oh no, what's this? Lay gasp! What a shocker, Hope was actually Bunavelza this whole time. He takes all our companions hostage and beckons us follow him into his dimension so he can finish up creating the new world, and of course, we do so. Bonavelza explains his new plan to Lightning, that being he wants her to take Etro's place as the new god of death, and keep the balance between the unseen realm and the living world. Lightning politely declines by beating the shit out of Bonavelza, because she wants a world not ruled by gods, in which humans can decide their own fates. Alright, so I'm not gonna lie, I seriously do not understand what is happening in this ending, but I will try my absolute best to make it sound comprehensive. So Lightning's plan originally was to plunge both her and Bunny into the unseen realm, but the fake version of Sarah he had created to keep her complacent goads her on to find the real version of Sarah. When Big Boy Bunny stole Sarah's soul, he also created Lumina because Lightning had some feelings she kept to herself or something. I'm not exactly sure, but Lumina merges back in with Lightning, which frees Sarah's soul and makes Lightning whole again. She then also saves Hope, who Bonavelza had taken hostage, and then joined together with everyone from the last few games' main cast, use the power of friendship and give Bonavelza the good old-fashioned team attack, turning him to crystal and freeing all the trapped souls, leaving Nova Chrysalia a darkened wasteland. Caius and Yule then appear, stating they will become the new gods of the Unseen Realm and keep the cycle of death and rebirth going so that people in the new world will actually be able to die. Noel isn't happy with that and gets all fussy. Caius then does a good thing for once in his life and lets the Yule that wishes to be with Noel go with us all to the new world, releasing her from her fate as a Cirrus, after which the universe gets fucking deleted and the remaining 11 people, that of course being the cast of characters, are left surrounding a crystal. After we touch the crystal, we initiate the Big Bang and the crystal farts out a new universe. We all then turn into some pixie fairy dust and reincarnate onto a very Earth-looking planet. The game ends with Lightning dressed up in some casual wear stepping off a train saying she's about to go meet some old friend. Editor's note here, hello. The footage you see for the final cutscene was taken from YouTube by Yik17 Studio. I actually died on the final phase of Bonavelza on my first attempt at the boss fight and took a nap before retrying, and then I, kind of forgot to hit the record button like a dumbass, and I didn't want to go back and fight him a third time just to record the final cutscene, so, thank you to Yik17 for the footage that I stole here. Go check them out on YouTube. So what do I think of the story and its ending? It's fucking ass. It is so bad. The other games weren't exactly high art in terms of their storytelling, but they at least made sense most of the time as individual pieces of narratives, when you weren't looking at them as all being a part of a, one overarching story. Lightning Returns doesn't have that courtesy, because the entire purpose of its story is to act as a conclusion to the plots that they had been building up from the previous two entries. Without those games, this game's plot does not exist, and to an extent, 13.2 suffers from the same problems, but you can go into 13.2 and not really have known anything about the events in 13, and probably still have been fine, because the game essentially recaps for you. Lightning Returns, nuh-uh. It assumes you know the events of all the prior games and have the lore of the world down pretty good, in all the wrong ways. It is just so jumbled, so confusing, so baffling, so nonsensical and absurd. You know it's bad when one of your game's trailers is a legitimate 8-minute long 16-bit recap of the previous two games' stories. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's really cool as a trailer concept, but also, what game needs to recap its story for 8 minutes as a trailer? I just think that it is the weakest story out of all of them that has some really weird ham-fisted plot points that just don't really make sense if you sit down to think about it for more than 2 seconds. Like, according to the wiki, you save Noel's soul early on in the game, but then later down the line, you apparently can't save anyone's souls because you aren't complete? So I guess we didn't actually save Noel's soul? Contradictory story elements that make no sense like this are littered everywhere in this game, and it brings down the story immensely. It is just really bad. Even when in comparison to the already lackluster rest of the trilogy, it's bad enough that I kind of felt robbed by the end of it of an actual satisfying conclusion. Now for my final two sections, I felt like talking about some aspects of the game I either liked or didn't like that I didn't want to ramble about too long in their respective sections of the video, but still wanted to mention, so I'm making a section dedicated entirely to my nitpicks and small joys. Something the game does that I enjoy a lot is rewarding players who actually feel like doing a lot of the content offered. For example, if you do enough quests and feed the biblically accurate tree enough Aradia, you'll actually unlock an extra day at the end of the game. And with this extra day, you will also unlock a new secret dungeon in the Dead Dunes. It is essentially a boss rush of the last ones, which is another system in place that I like a lot. Essentially, the last ones are, well, the last of their species. If you farm a specific enemy too often, you'll put them in a state of extinction, in which the last one of that species can spawn. If you choose to kill it, then that enemy is wiped from your game for the rest of your playthrough, meaning that you will not encounter that specific enemy anymore throughout the rest of your time playing, until you either start a new game or enter a new game plus. It's really neat. I think it's a super cool concept, and the final dungeon is essentially just 30 some odd rooms packed with every single last one that you could possibly encounter. Of course, if you do choose to kill them, you will be rewarded with some of the best accessories and weapons in the game, but they won't be a walk in the park, so you better be prepared. And speaking of optional final dungeons, within the game's actual final dungeon, right before the room where you go to fight Bunavelza, you have the option to take the final trial. Essentially just 4 straight corridors you go through to activate some lever, and at the end of it, you'll be rewarded with the Ultima Blade, the strongest weapon that you can get. I think, don't quote me on that. I also mentioned earlier that I would talk about the Chaos and Soul Seeds, so let me give you the quick rundown on how it works. Basically, there's chaos expansions that can pop up around any of the maps. Inside, enemies will spawn more frequently, and those enemies will have buffs such as higher damage and regenerative health. To get rid of it, you just gotta deal with the enemies. And of course, to go along with this, another thing that spawns inside of these chaos wells are these things called soul seeds. Now, as far as I'm aware, they serve no other purpose outside of being something you can trade in to a soul seed trader. It's essentially just a way to get easy gil. It's a neat concept and offers a more challenging battle when compared to the rest of the game, which is for the most part fairly straightforward and easy. The music is, of course, on point once again. I mean, did you expect anything less? Everyone who has worked on the soundtracks for the entire saga has been killing it the entire time. From the funky jazz tunes that play in Yusnaan during the night when everyone's out to celebrate, to the absolute god tier piece that is Almighty Bunavelza. Oh my god, people, when I tell you this might be my favorite final boss theme in any game ever, you best believe I mean it. The level of freedom that the game allows you is superb, and I mean in almost every aspect of the game, not just the customizability allowed when it comes to your build and outfits. The fact that you can choose which main story you want to complete and what order you want to complete them, or hell, even just not complete them at all and get the quote bad ending, it's nice. So much better than the previous 2 games. I do believe, though, that's every smaller system or mechanic of the game that I enjoy that I felt worth at least a mention. So let's go on ahead and talk about some of my nitpicks. Alright, so not wasting any time, the performance. Square Enix still somehow could not manage to get the game running on a computer without stuttering and crashing. I mean, sure, it was much better than 13.2, not even remotely as buggy, but I mean, come on. Being better than 13.2 is an extremely low bar to clear. Like, seriously, it just baffles me how bad Square seems to mess up their PC ports. And to go in hand with that, the control layouts and support is abysmal. You can't even use your mouse. There is literally zero mouse support for Lightning Returns, when there was full mouse support for the previous two entries, which forced me to use my only controller on hand, my PS4 controller, which of course brought with it its own slew of issues, because the key mappings were abysmal, making it so I could not for the life of me switch my garb in combat without wasting EP that I would want to be using elsewhere. Also, the game is just, I mean, there's no nice way to put this, it's kinda ugly. It released late 2013 in Japan and early 2014 worldwide, and when you stick it up and compare it to some of the other games that came out around that time frame, well, I mean, it just doesn't hold up. The graphics are dated by this point. I mean, do I need to bring up the damn dog again? Just look at his derpy ass face. And also, the god-awful use of 13 in the story. Oh my god. I get that it is the trilogy of the 13th game in the mainline series, but holy shit, does the number 13 have to be used for everything? They constantly say we have 13 days till the end. Vanille and Fang woke up 13 years ago. For God's sake, they even have this plotline about how we used to have 26 hours per day, but the mythical 13th hour before midday has disappeared. I absolutely hate the ham-fisting of the number 13. I also felt it was probably worth mentioning that the localization team, according to many sources, did a really piss-poor job, like so bad that a lot of the story was changed entirely during the translation from Japanese to English. So if you want the story in its intended form, there are countless resources online that will detail the differences between the JP script and the English script. I'll try and leave a few below in the description for you to check out if you want, but I think that's really all the small nitpicks from me personally. Most of my major gripes I had with the world or combat or story were already talked about in their respective sections, so I do think it's time to just take it to the finish line and give my ultimate thoughts on the series and finally answer the question I've had looming this entire time. Do I think that Lightning Returns is a bad game? Well, not entirely. I think there's good and bad aspects to the game. The worst aspect for me personally has gotta be the disappointing story, and the high note is probably the player freedom, but everyone is sure to find things they enjoy and dislike on their own. I will say, as an overall package, I think Lightning Returns was the best offering they had from the saga. I enjoyed it the most and found myself playing for hours at a time, going all the way till the sun was rising even.
It is now like 7:30 a.m. and the sun is finally rising. I've been playing since 6 a.m. yesterday.
But I can see why people might not enjoy this game compared to the others, because it is fundamentally a lot different. The other two entries are more traditional style Final Fantasy games. They are linear, you have your party of 3, you have set class roles. It's a lot more familiar than Lightning Returns might be. So it's up to you what you enjoy the best of the 3 games. As for the series as a whole, I'll be blunt. The criticisms are fair, 100%. I don't think it's even a question on whether or not they deserve their criticism, because the games are very clearly not the best on offer from Square Enix. I had a comment on my first video covering Final Fantasy XIII that was along the lines of, your criticisms and opinions are the same as the reviews from 10 years ago. You should watch some recent reviews and change your mind. And the thing is, that comment wasn't wrong, it's true. They are very similar to some of the criticisms from a decade ago, because the games aren't actively receiving updates or reworks or changes. They're single-player story-driven JRPGs. They're pretty much the exact same games today as they were on release, and they will still be this way 10 years, 20 years, 30 years from now, which means the criticisms won't be outdated or unfair, unless Square Enix, for some reason, decides to come and change up the game or release a remaster with fixes or a remake or something, which I guarantee they will probably never do. It's fine if you think the games are good or enjoyable, but you have to admit that there are other JRPGs out there that are just plain flat out better. But just because they are better doesn't mean that those games have to be your favorites. Star Ocean 3 is my favorite JRPG of all time, but I can admit it's probably nowhere near approaching the greatest out there. Off the top of my head, I can think of several that are better. Final Fantasy IX, Legend of Dragoon, Tales of Arise, Xenoblade Chronicles. It's completely fine to have differing opinions from the masses, and I love hearing why people enjoy certain games that others might not. The Lightning Saga isn't bad, it's not great, it's just average, and there's nothing wrong with that, because they are still enjoyable games, even with their perceived flaws. So yes, after all this time I spent playing the games, writing these reviews, and editing these videos, I think the criticisms are fair, but to go along with that, the games are just straight up fun more often than not. They're average games with some poor design at times, some really unlikable and bad characters, and a story so confusing it makes Neon Genesis Evangelion look like the least complex piece of media ever created, but they're still fun. This has been a really fun series to make. I do still want to go back and kinda maybe tidy up my review on FF13 since it was mostly just summarizing the story and not focusing too much on the aspects I actually disliked or liked, but I need a break from the Lightning Saga for now. I want to stick with this kind of formula, so if you've made it this far, might as well subscribe and drop a like first of all, and secondly, comment below what series you'd like to see me cover. I was thinking maybe Darksiders or Dragon Age, but I'd love to hear what you guys want to see. That's all I have for you though. Thank you for watching, I'll catch you next time. Good night.